This is the BoiseDev Outlook, presented by Regence Blue Shield of Idaho. In case you hadn't noticed from the cranes and all the activity, the Treasure Valley is still growing quickly. And in the next hour, we're going to take a deep dive look at 4 areas that we think are important to growth. We'll start with Elaine Clegg. She's the new CEO of Valley Regional Transit. She'll discuss with our Margaret Carmel some of the ways that transit and growth are interacting. Then, Dr. Dan Meltzer of Regence Blue Shield of Idaho is here. He's going to talk about what is to come in healthcare with the national COVID-19 emergency finally ending. Then it's on to real estate. We'll start with commercial real estate. Peter Oliver of TOK is going to discuss with me how the industrial, retail, and general office sectors are looking. Lastly, Gretchen Parsons will discuss the residential market with Tracy Kasper. She's the current national president of the National Association of Realtors. We've got a great hour for you. We hope you'll enjoy it. The BoiseDev Outlook is next.
There's no place quite like Idaho. That's why Regence Blue Shield of Idaho is constantly reimagining the healthcare experience, tailoring it to fit the needs of local families and businesses. Rooted here since 1946, we're shaping the future with cutting-edge digital solutions, Idaho-based customer service, and unparalleled access to top doctors. That's the Regence difference you can count on. We get you because we are you.
Welcome back to the BoiseDev Outlook. We'll start today's program with our Margaret Carmel.
Thanks, Don. I'm here with Elaine Clegg, the CEO of Valley Regional Transit. We're going to be talking about the future of public transit in the Treasure Valley. Thanks so much for coming on our program today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So we all know Idahoans love to drive. Why do you think more public transit should be part of the Treasure Valley's future?
Well, whether you love to drive or not, there are times when it's not convenient to drive, when there's bad weather, other instances. There's also 31% of Idahoans who do not drive. They're either too young or too old, or perhaps they have a disability or they don't own a car. And we need opportunities for them to travel. To me, transit is one way to make sure that people have freedom to move around the state.
So thinking ahead to 10 years, what do you think our public transit system could look like, and how could it address some of the issues we're going to have as our region continues to grow?
Well, if you look at other regions around the country, the ones who have responded to growth with only building more and wider roads, continue to have congestion, continue to have traffic that people aren't happy with, and continue to have really hard commutes. So looking forward 10 years, I'm hopeful that this region will have access to the rail corridor that runs through the middle of the valley as a regional express route to travel parallel to the freeway if you choose not to drive and would rather let someone else do the driving while you read or use Wi-Fi or whatever else you want to do. In addition to that, we will have a really good, frequent, high-quality bus system that connects to those rail stops. So once you arrive at a stop from that rail, you can get where you need to go, wherever your final destination is. In addition, that high-quality, frequent bus transit will offer the opportunity for people to travel around their communities without getting on the rail in a way that's convenient, attractive, fast. And if we do all of that, I think that we can avoid some of the mistakes that other places, especially in the West, have made as they've grown.
So that sounds expensive. Obviously, we are constrained here in Idaho because right now we don't have state funding for transit. How do you envision that getting paid for?
Well, regional transit authorities are the only subdivision of state government in Idaho that doesn't have a taxing authority. It doesn't work very well. I think anyone who has been a member of a agency that has taxing authority would understand that it wouldn't work very well if you didn't. So I do look forward to having a conversation about how to fix that. I don't know what that tax will be. I don't know how it will make it through the legislature. I do know that the residents of this region, at least all of the polling that I've seen over the last 2 decades, consistently indicate that they'd be willing to tax themselves to have good transit. I think that's a piece of it. I think the other piece of it is that if we do this well and do this right, we can have a fare box return that would significantly help, especially on the rail corridor, with the costs of it.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you think that there is a fiscal conservative argument to this, like something that you can say to people who maybe are Republicans and not as gung-ho about transit as Democrats usually are?
Well, it's interesting. I always hear that we subsidize transit. The fact of the matter is we subsidize all transportation. And so if we want a robust economy, then we need to subsidize transportation. Transit is a part of that. I would say there's a big return on investment with transit if we do it well and do it right. It's interesting when we look at roadway projects, we often say, gosh, in 10 years, we're going to need this to be this much bigger because we project all these people will be here. And when we talk about transit, we often say, well, what was ridership last year? Oh, it wasn't good enough. Maybe we shouldn't fund it anymore. So I hope to turn that around and say, if we're going to talk about investing in transportation for the future, let's talk about that on both sides of the ledger. And I think there's a big return on investment if we invest in transit in the right way, getting people to job sites. Right now, your worker pool, the employees that you could hire may be quite a bit smaller than you'd appreciate or need to have because they can't get to work. So transit could provide that. Where are people going to live and still be able to get to work? Again, if you have good transit, you can increase your pool of employees. And third, what about your customer base? Where do they live? How are they going to get to you? So transit plays a role in all of that, just as driving does. It's not that driving's bad. It's just that transit is another choice for that.
Something you talked about to me before is freedom to move, where it's about trying to build transit and more about just giving people options. Can you on that and your thoughts?
Sure. It really is, I think, freedom to move. Right now, we have a system where if you want to get somewhere, you need to own and be able to drive a car. And if you don't have that, you're not free to move around your community. You're not independent. Say you are an older adult who has a disability and you're no longer allowed to drive, you're now dependent on other people to take you to the places that you need to go to live an independent life. No one, I think, wants that. No one sees that as a good future for themselves or their loved ones. And if, say, again, that you're a suburban mom or a suburban teen, right now, you depend on that parent to get you to all the places you need to go. That creates a lack of freedom for both those teens and for those parents who are driving them around. And if we had a good transit system that allowed those teens who are not old enough yet to drive to get around on their own, it would free up the lives of both sides of that ledger to do more and be more.
For sure. I think we all remember our mom getting tired of driving us to whatever activity day after day. Whenever you're thinking about how this links into major employers, obviously Micron is a big elephant coming into the room. They're going to hire a lot of new people out at their site. How will transit link up to that?
If we get access to the rail corridor, there will be a rail stop within a mile of their facility. That rail stop will have express rapid service to almost the whole valley. And then there'd be a bus shuttle that would take you that last mile. In the meantime, we foresee being able to provide good express bus service across the valley to a site like Micron.
Just a couple of weeks ago, we were both up at Sun Valley at the Boise Metro Chamber's annual leadership conference. And there we heard from an executive at Amtrak, and she gave us a best case scenario get rail. Can you tell us more about the status of that? I mean, this isn't coming tomorrow, right?
It isn't. However, I did talk to both her and a former Amtrak employee after the speech that she gave. And in that, she indicated that it would be 10 or 15 years before we'd be able to use the rail corridor. She was talking about the long distance piece of it, and there is quite a bit more track and quite a bit more infrastructure that will need to be addressed before we can go all the way from Portland, say, to Las Vegas. However, shorter pieces of that, especially the 17 miles within the valley, could be addressed sooner. And the numbers I heard, both from the other former Amtrak employee I talked to and one that I heard a couple of months ago talk about it, was between 5 and 7 years instead of 10 to 15. So pieces of it could happen sooner. Long term, just like any transportation project, is going to take a while to get all of the parts in place. But that doesn't mean that we can't start tomorrow with some of the smaller bits.
Recently, your agency rolled out a new plan, the Better Bus Initiative, to reformat the network and make some changes. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Right now we do have a bit of a funding shortfall. Inflation has hit our industry just as it has almost every other industry. Buses are more expensive, maintenance more expensive, drivers, operators' pay is more expensive. Compressed natural gas, which most of our buses run on, has gone up 61% in the last couple of years. Given all of that, if we have the same funding next year as what we have this year, we'll only be able to provide fewer hours of service. So we have a scenario out that shows what kind of service we could offer with those fewer hours and the same funding. But we also, at the behest of our funding partners, cities and counties, produce two scenarios that show what we might do with the same service hours and more funding. And rather than stick with the system that we have today, which is not a bad system by any means, but isn't really moving forward in building frequency and building a better bus system, we took those same hours and focused them on a concentrated network, core network, especially in Ada County, that moves people faster, more connectedly, and more frequently. We also offered a scenario that did some of that and offered some on-demand or dial a ride, web ride kind of service in parts of the county that otherwise would lose service in this scenario. So we're gathering input on that. Neither of those two scenarios is likely to go forward exactly as is. Once we get that input, we will work with our funding partners and work with the public to develop what will be the final service plan that will roll out in the fall. But regardless, my hope is, especially if we can maintain the service hours, that this is a plan that begins to build toward higher ridership, better, more frequent bus service that attracts more people than what we have today.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Do you know about when we're going to know once we get a new bus network or not?
Well, the survey that we're running right now will be out for about a month. We'll have a public hearing in the Boise side at the Boise City Council to consider how much funding they would like to contribute in the beginning of June. Our local partners' budgets will be set in June and July, and we should know by the August board meeting of the Valley Regional Transit Board what the final scenario will be.
Great. I think we're all looking forward to that. Obviously, we don't want to get too in the weeds here because we only have so much time, but can you hit the highlights of what are some new connections, new features of that bus line that you could expect if your proposal goes forward?
Well, I think one of the biggest features is that there are some north-south connections in Ada County that don't exist today. And those connections, whether we get the more frequent routes or not, allow people to move in different directions more easily. So, for instance, instead of having to go all the way downtown to Main Street Station and then back out to Emerald or the mall or Orchard or Overland, you would be able to take a route from 36th and State Street that would travel north and south toward Fairview, toward Emerald, toward Overland, or the same on Glenwood and Cole. I think that connected network style will begin to move us in a direction that will allow people to get to the places that they really need to get to more quickly overall on the network.
Something that you guys have talked about is how you're often making choices between buses going more places or buses running more frequently. Can you talk about that tension?
Sure. So imagine that your car only started every hour. You had 1 minute every hour to go start your car. And wherever you needed to go, you had to make sure that you caught that hour or you missed it. Not very convenient, right? And that's why a lot of our bus system is like that. Now imagine that you got a new software upgrade and now your car can start every 30 minutes. Wow, that's quite a bit better. Still not great, but certainly a lot more convenient. Now, just imagine that the next super software upgrade allowed you to start that car every 15 minutes. And then suddenly you have the freedom to get where you need to go in a timely manner. So frequency really is an important feature of a good transit network. And right now we have 2 routes that have that 15-minute frequency of about 6 hours a day. In this new scenario, one of them, we have a 3rd route that has that, and we have 4 more routes that have 30-minute service all day long, where today they have only a few hours of 30-minute service and the rest of the day is 60 minutes. So we think that that frequency could be a real benefit to many of our riders. On the other hand, right now, more people have access to the system because those infrequent buses run more places than they would in the scenario that we've produced. However, if you look at the number of riders that are utilizing that access, it's quite low as a percentage because it's so inconvenient. That 60-minute frequency just doesn't work very well for many people. So while the scenario that doesn't offer as much access across the Ada County and Canyon County as the other scenario, it does offer access that is enough more convenient that our projections show that more people will ride than are riding today. The other trade-off that we could consider is offering the on-demand service that would provide some of that coverage. And when you have access to a larger area, it's typically in the transit world called coverage. And in offering that more coverage in an on-demand way, rather than through a fixed route, we can perhaps use that to mine the data and find out exactly where the demands are and where it might be worthwhile to build fixed routes in the future. So my hope is that we have some combination of the two so that we can begin to gather some of that data, but that we also begin to take advantage of some of that more frequent service.
Yeah, and can you give us a quick primer on how on-demand works? Basically, you would say, okay, here's where I am, and I would like to get to work at St. Luke's or Micron will come pick you up. Is that right?
So it'll be a website or a call, and you can say, here's where I am. There will be a site near you that we've already identified that would be a pickup site, much like a bus stop. So you'd walk to that site. The on-demand vehicle would pick you up within a specified time. It would tell you when it would pick you up. We'll also likely, if we move that direction in Ada County, have a few designated sites that are the farthest ones it would take you to, say, for instance, Main Street Station or Town Square Mall, and or it could drop you at a connection to one of those more frequent routes. So at that point, it would be up to you. What's the quickest, best way to get to your final destination? Is it to go to one of the big transfer stations, or is it to just get to one of the frequent routes?
Okay, that makes sense. So here, last question. I don't know if I've ever asked you this before, but what made you fall in love with transit? What got you so fired up about this?
Oh, wow. Good question. I lived in Denver as a child for about 6 years. My mother did not drive at that point. And so we were out kind of in the suburbs. It's now not at all in the suburbs if you look at Denver today, but in that time it was. But there was good bus service out there. And we rode the bus all over town. And I really learned the kind of freedom that that bus could offer you, even in a place where you had a parent who couldn't drive you because she didn't drive at that point. She went with us, certainly, on most of those rides. But that really cemented for me how wonderful the bus could be in providing access and providing freedom. When I first moved back to Boise, my grandparents lived downtown. We lived up on the bench. I could get to their house by bus. I also rode a bike a lot, but those were my two main ways of getting around town, were bus and bike. I did that even at the time that I started at Boise State. I still lived up on the bench, and just have always enjoyed both the ability to travel without having to be the driver, letting someone else be the driver, but also the ability for more people to travel who might not otherwise be able to.
Well, that's our time. I really appreciate you joining us today. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Margaret. Now let's talk about commercial real estate. Peter Oliver is the managing partner at TOK Commercial Real Estate. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Happy to. Don, always a big supporter of you, and thank you for all your great work you're doing for the community.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So, the theme today has been growth and change, and looking at how that growth and change is really affecting our valley, and you and the folks at TOK obviously really handle the commercial sector. And so I wanted to kind of just get a pulse on where things stand. We're 3 years past the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, although still feeling some effects. And a lot of things have changed. So I wanted to kind of get your feeling on where the market stands right now.
Sure. I mean, in general, I would categorize our market as healthy, pretty much on all fronts. We're very fortunate, especially if you look around even across the country on similar size metros. We're in really good shape on all fronts, and I still stand by that today.
What sector do you think is seeing the most strength right now, and where do you see a lot of things really working and clicking?
Interestingly enough, I would say on the retail side, actually, if you recall, you've written a lot about this, but a mere 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of people that thought retail was dead or in jeopardy, whatever strength of word you want to use. And, our market is strong. Our vacancies are low. You can take some, recent phenomena with Shopko going out, for instance. All of their spaces have been backfilled, some with new people, some with expanding tenants from the market. So I look at that as very positive. Most recently, we've got a couple of new holes to fill with Bed Bath & Beyond going through their situation. But even that, you look at it, a lot of those types of results were from, over leverage at a company level. The stores, locally might have been doing fine, but they're a victim of the corporate side of things. So, shop space is very healthy. You know how it is trying to get into a restaurant these days. You better call a week or two in advance if it's one of your favorite places. So to me, all those bode well. I talk to a lot of my friends that are in the retail world, and they're pleased.
We had kind of the late part of the last decade. As you kind of mentioned, we had a lot of especially the national chains go away. Shopko was a big one, Hastings, the Babies R Us and Toys R Us locations. We've had Bed Bath and Beyond go out. Is there any worry in that area that we might see another uptick again, or do you feel like Bed Bath is kind of an outlier? And on the flip side of that, are there still a big line of people looking to come into the market?
Yeah, I think there's really not a simple answer to a lot of these questions. Locally, again, activity has been healthy on the retail side. There's people looking. What we look at, and we dive into the data a lot here. I'm kind of an econ junkie at heart, but we've surpassed. We're at 850, 875 as far as our MSA goes. So we're quickly approaching that million population MSA mark, and that historically across the country has been kind of the next tipping point when it comes to retail. And we've seen that with Topgolf coming in. We've got Shields under construction now. And so my speculation is, there's going to be some casualties along the way. Some of it is definitely, tied in with Amazon. It's tied in with the internet. But those people that have adapted and have learned to use the internet as a tool, they've actually seen it as an improvement to their revenue. So when we look at, for instance, when we look at centers that we're selling, we look at the tenants, are they Amazon proof or not? I mean, that's kind of a new phenomenon with everything that's going on. But locally and Treasure Valley wide, I'm optimistic on retail. D&B Supply, another great local success story. I don't know if you've been out to their new superstore yet at North Ranch.
I'm a nerd. I went and walked it. I was scared.
You go. There you go. So a lot of good things going on, and I always have to preface things. I'm an optimist, but if you dig back and you look at what's happening here, it's pretty positive. But I look at our population growth, our income levels, everything is pointing to the right direction.
So if retail's kind of that strongest, where do you see some of the struggles? Is there a sector that's maybe having a little bit more chop in the water?
There's choppy pieces of it. And so by that, I mean, let's take the hot topic for right now, office, right? We do have literally a handful of larger blocks of office that have hit the market since the beginning of the year. You've got, Citibank with their call center, DirecTV with their call center. The story of Tandem very well. You've got CenturyLink's space downtown. And while there's success behind it and growth, you've got Cradle Point, giving up some space at Boise Plaza. That being said, there's not a simple one answer to it either. Some of it is stay-at-home issues. Some of it is technology. With call centers now, they can track their productivity a lot better than they used to via software that's been enhanced, and all that's kind of a result of the pandemic. So you've got all these forces going on. So in those big chunks of space, that really doesn't represent the bulk of our market. I mean, our market is still the bulk of our tenants are between 1,500 feet and say 5,000. That market is still healthy. It's not as robust as it was. The velocity isn't as strong as it was, but I kind of have categorized this. We're in kind of a COVID correction. Correction might be a little bit strong of a word, but you could say a COVID normalization. People went out and hired tons of people, employees. We're seeing changes in that. That impacts office space, efficiencies. There was one school of thought, which was everyone's going to have more office space because they need more space. And it was everyone's going to work at home. So
radiuses, right?
It's really interesting to think through all of these things, but there is no steadfast one answer for it. But in general, that is the weak spot in the office market. We've got these big blocks of space, but I would still rather be in the Treasure Valley with those big blocks of space than other metro areas, for obvious reasons. And then go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, and then on the industrial side, we have a large amount of new inventory coming on in the next 12 months. That portion of the market, the challenge with it, it's a lot of space and it's a lot of the same space, meaning the size of the space. The bulk of our tenants in industrial are still between, say, 5 and 15,000 square feet. Our upper end has grown a fair amount because our market has grown, but a lot of these new projects, if they can get down to 20, 25,000 feet, that's kind of on the smaller end. So that one's going to be interesting to watch too. Good news is super high quality. We are seeing our tenant sizes grow. So that'll be one to watch on the industrial side. But below that, the market is as tight as I've ever seen it. So it's kind of parts of the different product types.
So it's a bit of a change, right? I mean, for a while, industrial just seemed like it was hair on fire in the market coming out of the pandemic. Now you're saying maybe a little slowing there.
Yeah, again, you have to peel back the data, though. It's in that bigger size range. Mm-hmm. If you get down to the largest segment of the industrial market as far as tenants go, still very, very active and very, very tight.
Amazon come in, build a couple million square feet out there, near the Idaho Center, and then announce some other thing. Well, I actually wouldn't say announce. They wouldn't confirm, but plan some things with their colors and their schemes, and they were clearly Amazon. And then it seems like they maybe pulled back some of that. Is that having a ripple effect? Is that playing out in other places, or is it really just mostly this mid-band kind of thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Nationally, that's what's happening with Amazon, and they definitely got very, very aggressive. Locally, we are not seeing a number of support tenants that are being impacted by that. They built their fulfillment center. They have another center out by the airport. They had another one planned, which got shelved on the west side of the airport. And then they built their van center. The van center is an interesting phenomena. I recently drove to San Diego to help move my son to Phoenix. And between here and San Diego, we drove by literally 5 of those. And they're just like the one here. They're brand new, state-of-the-art Amazon van centers, completely vacant. And they're just sitting there. And as you get to bigger markets, outside of Vegas, outside of San Diego, they get bigger, even down in Salt Lake, than the one here, but they're just sitting there. So those things, nationally are going to have to get absorbed. But again, focusing back on the Treasure Valley, we're not seeing a lot of Amazon-related folks that have been impacted by their, hitting the brakes.
So let's kind of swerve back to retail or to the office segment for a second. Is there concern that a lot of people who had leases in place, you're hearing about this nationally, leases in place, they come up, they vacate them, you start to see rates plunge because there are fewer tenants and the quality goes down. And is there any indication that might be in the offing here, or is that still strong enough that that those types of things might absorb?
Yeah, again, another good question. And I like to use kind of general statements on, where we are in each cycle. I think this is the 5th cycle of my career. And we are in the I don't know stage right now. And this applies to a myriad of topics that we'll touch on. So what we're seeing right now, the answer would be no. We are not seeing a softening of rates. We still have decent activity in the traditional size range that I mentioned. One of the things that I've been watching with the slowdown of the residential side starting before, you could say commercial started to cool off, we've had very few downsize or people vacating space tied in with the residential sector, meaning mortgage companies, title companies, on down the line. If you were around in 05, 6, and 7, it was an absolute Armageddon. It was terrible. So we're not seeing that. So that's staying very stable. We are seeing some firms grow. We're seeing companies move here that have been, waiting to come into Boise for it to hit a certain size mark, which we now have hit. So I'm optimistic on the market within the certain parameters. We are going to have to deal with these bigger chunks of space. But again, I'd rather be in Boise, Idaho, or the Treasure Valley dealing with it than other metros, because I think we're going to see some companies continue to relocate.
Are we starting to see some spread? I mean, even downtown here where I'm at, and I know you're at a lot, it's not quite as vibrant as before the pandemic. It's picked up certainly, but it's just not. There's just clearly not as many people, especially once the legislative session leaves town. Do you think that some areas are going to see more strength? That maybe like the newer stuff at 10 Mile and Meridian might be stronger than downtown? You think it'll all equalize, or is there some differences in the different sectors of the geographical area?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, if you are a heavy parking user, it's going to be a challenge to be downtown. We have limited parking options. It costs money for parking spaces, so that's one of the many drivers. I think a lot of it is we're fast food, drive-through Americans. We like stuff to happen quick. It takes time to recover from what we went through with COVID, plain and simple. So if you talk to the companies, and it's the bigger companies, the publicly traded companies, they're having the harder time getting people back to the office for a myriad of reasons. But it is happening. It's just happening at a slower pace. I mean, you go drive. I just drove back from 10 Mile 15 minutes ago. That drive at this time of day is noticeably more busy now. To me, it's noticeably more busy. When you leave downtown between 4:30 and 5:30, it's getting back to where it was. But there are still several large companies downtown that are at 30 to 40%, or they're 3 days in the office. It's just going to take time for that to rebuild, in my opinion.
Downtown, it's all the construction. It just makes everything harder.
Oh yeah, I mean, over 10th and 11th on Grove Street. I mean, you might as well just walk everywhere.
I park right in the middle of that, so it's always
there you go.
Very fun at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What do you see? What role do you see interest rates playing? Continuing to be high. People are telling me maybe projects are going to have trouble getting financed at rates that make sense. Do you see some of that supply starting to taper over time?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two facets in general with interest rates. So on the construction side, absolutely, we're already seeing that. I mean, construction interest rates have almost doubled, and it was already challenging to do new projects because of costs, because of supply chain issues, all the stuff we've been hearing about for the last 3 years. Throw interest rates in the mix, and it's not doable. So yes, that's going to impact new projects. You talk to all the developers, you know them all, and they'll tell you the same thing. So that is going to, and that's what the Fed's trying to do, right? They're trying to slow things down. On the flip side of it, on the permanent side, it's impacting it as well. So if people are looking to go out and buy investment property and such, which impacts my daily world a lot, it doesn't make sense. We've got this lagging effect with sellers. A lot of sellers are still back in even the first quarter of 22 or 21, and they're still looking to get these cap rates. In round numbers, we've got about 100 basis point spread between bid and ask.
Interesting.
And it's, even if you're an all cash buyer and you're a fairly savvy investor, you're not gonna overpay. You're going to use what interest rates are as your benchmark, and most people are not going to sign up for neutral or negative leverage. So yes, it's definitely having an impact. You can follow up with any of the developers, and I think the projects that are going now, they're all stuff that started 2 and 3 years ago.
Interesting. So maybe a little lag later in this decade, it sounds like.
Correct.
What are some of the other factors playing in here? We've got population growth and construction costs, and how do those play a role in the inventory and in all the different things we've been talking about here today?
They're all part of the equation, and you combine them all, and thus the challenge of being a developer and the development business. So with all those factors rolling into a project, risk is extremely high. And then you can sprinkle in some of these outliers, which we don't know yet with some of these bank issues that have come up. There are some banks that just are saying, we're tapping out for right now. Some of them have to tap out for right now. Right. So we've got all these continued added factors coming into the equation. So, I mean, what I think it's going to be those that are very well capitalized, that have very strong banking partners. They are going to do very select projects that make sense, but it's not going to be at the fevered pitch that we've seen. I'm not a contractor. I have lots of friends in that business. I don't see costs changing. What a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the build back projects are now all starting from the, I call it the hidden stimulus. Those are all starting now across the country. We have a lot of them in the state of Idaho. So any kind of slowdown that might have been happening in other facets of construction, meaning the private side, are now going to be, going into demand for the public side.
Interesting. What else should people watch out for? What's the thing to see? What's the thing to notice?
Well, we're seeing, again, if you take in migration, it has slowed, quite a bit now with post-COVID, et cetera, but people are still moving here. We're still getting companies that are very interested in our market, mainly because they're leaving other markets where business is not conducive or there's other challenges. So for us, I think it's very important for us to continue to focus on having safe communities, clean communities. I know everyone doesn't like talking about a quality of life, but that is a big part of it. And that covers so many different things. Our trails, it's just taking care of what we have. And then I see one of the positives of kind of a pause is to focus on things like infrastructure and give everybody a chance to catch up during this time. So those are the things that I'm watching, but I'm optimistic, and I see a good, steady long-term future for the Treasure Valley in our sector. Sounds like optimism is the word for the day. I'm optimistic. I think we have a lot of good things. I'd rather be here than a lot of other places. And so I'm excited about the future. Peter Oliver with TOK, thanks for taking some time with us. Absolutely. Thank you, Don, and thank you again for everything you do. Now, from the commercial side to the residential side, Gretchen Parsons has Tracy Kasper.
I'm sitting down here with Tracy Kasper. She's the president-elect of the National Association of Realtors. Tracy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Well, today we're going to talk about what's going on with home prices in the Boise area and kind of the general Ada County area. And so what I wanted to ask you, the most recent information that we've gotten from the Intermountain Multiple Listing Service, it shows that the median price for a home in Ada County in March was $483,450. Now, that's down quite a bit from April of 2022 when the median price was $595,000. So what can you say about, will the prices in the near future continue to drop a little? Are they leveling off? What can you say about that?
Well, I think there may be two things in play that we can talk about. First of all, if you just take one singular month over another singular month, a lot of things could have happened. If we look back in 2022, even 2021 and 20, we've had no inventory. So that lack of inventory had to be made up. And what was making up a lot of it last year was the new construction. So new construction compared to a residential resale home, for instance, depending on that size and location and different things, can tend to be higher priced. So did we sell more new construction? My guess is yes. And that's what took that median price up higher. Now this year, are we getting a little more balanced? Not quite. We still are seeing a massive crunch in our inventory. We're still less than 1.5 months, just kind of right at that, where pre-pandemic, we were at 2.5 months. So we're starting to see prices come down a bit. We also saw prices when we were overbidding for those couple of years during the pandemic significantly. We watched us, overbid anywhere from 20 to 30%. So coming down where we have is really a leveling. So I loved your word. I think you're exactly right. I think we're leveling back to what would be our new normal. We haven't had normal in a really long time, considering the fact that we went through a deep downturn in that 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, even 12. We just finally started coming out of it. So if you think about 2012, 13 finally coming up, we've been in an increasing market ever since. So it was time for us to level out. That's what is, in our opinion, sustainable. So we're looking forward to it. For those who bought at that, what would be considered a peak, you're not that far from the peak. If you do an average year over year, there's been about a 10% decrease in pricing overall, but you'll make that up over time, no question.
And you mentioned inventory. What can you say about the overall supply of housing now in Ada County and then maybe in Canyon County as well?
Both are experiencing the same thing. Again, that shortage of inventory. So we are right now currently sitting at, I think, 1.49 months. So 1.5 months of inventory. To put that into a little perspective, they say that a balanced market is 6 months, where it doesn't lend itself more to a buyer's market or to a seller's market. But again, before the pandemic, we were averaging for probably 3 or 4 years right at 2.5 months of inventory. If we creeped up to 3, we were excited because it's like, oh, good, there's more choices for those buyers, and sellers were still being very competitive, no question. So 1.5 months is tough.
Okay. And so some people have mentioned, or they think that maybe there's a supposed crash coming in the future. What do you have to say about that?
We don't believe that there is one. There's so many things that are different this time, and we'll say this time versus last time, meaning that, again, that's 2008, 9, 10 era. We had terrible lending practices in place at that time. That has significantly changed. So while you're seeing that the lending has increased in some of those fees, has decreased in some of those fees in some places, you still have to qualify. So the idea that we're on a slippery slope where we're starting to do that stated income again and those sorts of things, not nearly what we were doing before. There are some circumstances, there are some professional loans that will take a doctor, for instance, and they will take that contract and kind of bet on them a bit, but nothing like what we were doing before, where you could just walk in and say, this is how much I make, and there wasn't any verification. So that has changed significantly. The other thing, in my opinion, that's changed tremendously is everything Idaho did. If you look back at the last 2 decades of our government officials trying to attract business, bringing that industry in, bringing other industries that we hadn't had before. So you're seeing companies come from all over the country that are bringing their entire operation and their workforce into the Boise area because they've found us out. We're affordable. We don't have a lot of government red tape. Permits are easier to get than waiting 8 years in some places, or spending exorbitant fees in order to be able to build. So we are so business friendly, which is something that has been a target for a lot of our elected officials over all these years, and we are seeing that come to fruition. So when you see this influx of not just people, but business and industry, that changes the landscape of our entire valley, actually. So there's a balance there as well. And that's a lot of the reason why we're still seeing that inventory crunch, because we still have people moving in.
And speaking of that inventory crunch, you mentioned how there is so much new construction to catch up. Is there a particular type of house or property that's like desired? Are people specifically looking for new construction, or that's just kind of maybe what's more of available? Can you speak to that?
2 things. One, it is what's more available. We do see a lot of sellers not selling right now because they have that 2.5% or 3% interest rate. So they don't want to give that up and go into a new house at the 6 or 6.5% that they would be paying now. So that's one of the things that's kind of stymied a lot of our sellers of going onto the market quite yet. They're waiting for those interest rates to level back out, which we think they will. The other thing, as far as the new construction, here's my opinion. I do think that we have 2 of the largest demographics, which is our baby boomers and our millennials, that are in the market right now. The baby boomers finally kind of outpaced the millennials a bit on buying, because I think they're looking for a different product type of, being able to drop keys and play. But I believe that those demographics are looking for a very similar home. They're looking for a smaller footprint, a smaller home, high amenities. They just want to be able to drop those keys and go play on the weekend. So we don't have enough of that. We have a lot of that, what we are so used to, which is the 3-bed, 2-bath, 2-car garage on, a nicer sized lot. And we believe that there's a product type that we're missing. So we're seeing Boise start to do this. Their city council is considering a new zoning ordinance where they can allow that smaller home. Tiny homes, I think, are going to be really popular. I think people are just looking to live a little bit differently in a little bit smaller footprint.
And what about maybe a particular neighborhood? Is there, or an area of, the Boise area that people are really looking at buying, or it's just kind of what's available?
It's what's available, no question. Are there pockets that are more popular? Of course there are. It's those amenities that they're looking for, where they can have that walkable neighborhood, where they can have those amenities and those services close to them, where they can have the entertainment, where they can be close to hospitals, where they can maybe be close to the airport because they don't work here. They live here and play here, and then they travel and get to wherever the job is, depending on how often they have to do that. So we're just seeing so many different lifestyles that have found Boise to live in, no question. So it's all over, and it's right now what's available.
Okay. And then also I was going to ask, looking a little bit down the road, maybe 5-10 years, how do you expect the Treasure Valley housing market to change over the next 5-10 years? And what factors would be driving that?
A lot of, I think, of what I just mentioned before. I do think we still will see a lot of companies come in, a lot of industry, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of distribution. I also think that our pricing on homes will level out, where we will see those single digit increases, which, by the way, are just more sustainable. And it's what we've been hoping for now for almost a decade. So if we see that 5 to 8% increase year over year, we think that that will be a very sustainable market. And that's what we're predicting over the next decade, literally.
Okay. And also I wanted to go back a bit. You mentioned the zoning code and how that would allow for maybe more of the type of homes that people desire right now. How else do you see, if you've been able, it's quite a lengthy packet, but if you've, looked through it, how else do you see that kind of affecting homes in the area?
The homes that are existing in the area?
I guess homes that are existing, and then would it change, I guess, more like homes that are able to be built as well?
Yeah, no, we're looking for a higher density. We're looking for a different lifestyle. We're looking for more townhomes that are attached. We're looking for more condos that are in a contained building. We're looking for smaller homes, patio homes. We're just looking for that smaller footprint. Mm-hmm. And yes, we need to build more. Over the entire United States, we are about 5.5 million units behind because of that deep downturn so many years ago. Then we saw, just as we are gaining momentum, a pandemic that stopped a supply chain. So that stymied a lot of our growth, where we were finally thinking we would catch up with some of those units. Now we're just right back to where we were before the pandemic. So we have a lot of ground to make up in order to fill the populace that's out there. Our families have finally spread back out. People are not necessarily living with each other like they were before. So we have a shortage, there's no doubt. I think Boise is being very forward thinking, and I think they're also addressing what people are looking for in that lifestyle change. I think it's going to change a lot from what we're used to.
And you just mentioned the pandemic and how it had an effect on, there was some labor shortages and that type of thing. And also people found Boise out when people were able to work from home and stuff. People discovered our area and they're like, oh, well, this is a great place to live. Are there any other factors that you also think the pandemic kind of changed the landscape of home real estate in the area?
Yeah, I think that through a pandemic, a lot of people took a double check on their life and said, how am I living? And is this what I want? So when you look at Idaho, and you can be in the mountains, as we all know, in 30 minutes, you can, be hiking out your backyard in some places in the valley. You can be on the water, you can be fishing. You still have high speed internet, and you can work and do the job. And employers were not looking for you to be in the office. So many big cities still have not come back to work. Our government in DC is not back in the office quite yet. So even employers there are competing with the government because people are staying home and able to work. So the idea that they discovered Boise, the other thing I think is a political landscape. They saw a commonality that they were looking for. I think the pandemic brought out some extremes on both sides, and people were looking for like-minded people to be around. And so I think that's been a big draw for Idaho, for sure.
Are you able to compare the Boise home real estate market with maybe other cities nearby, or is it unique in that maybe it doesn't compare?
Well, we'll always say we're unique. There's no doubt in that. One of the areas that we get compared to a lot is Salt Lake. Idaho and Utah both were very first out of the gate after the pandemic to recuperate in job growth. We are still, Idaho is number one, and we have been number one. We lost number one to Utah for a little while and then came right back. So the idea that our job growth since the pandemic has outpaced the entire country. But again, that's what brought a lot of people. That's what's created a lot of the frenzy of buying the homes and had those big 20 and 30% over bids that we saw on our real estate. So Boise right now is poised. We're probably in the top 10 for being one of the more expensive markets, just in comparison to everything else that's around us. One of the top ones, though, that's going to struggle a lot and probably lose more value just because of what they gained and where they're at now is San Francisco. So they're close enough that they impact us. But for the most part, we're still very affordable relatively. We still are that great place to live that people are still looking for. So it hasn't stopped people from coming here.
Okay. And say someone in the Treasure Valley area, if they're wanting to sell their home right now, what advice would you give?
Price it right. When you are talking with your realtor and the realtor comes to you and says, here's where I think that you are in the market, the idea that we can push it, that those days are gone. Be honest. I will tell you that you can push it maybe a tiny bit, but if you push it too much and you overprice the property, the buyers will tell you that and you will sit. You won't get showings, you won't get offers, even though you think, they can always make a lower offer. The buyers aren't doing that right now. They're being very prudent and they're looking at those homes that are priced right, and that's where they're migrating to. So buyers are more picky. Buyers have more choices than they had when we only had a week of inventory. And those were tough times. Sellers did really, really well, but buyers did not. So buyers are a little shop-worn coming out of that. So they're very particular. They also are paying those higher interest rates. So they're making sure that every single dollar that they're spending is well spent. So they're not going to overbuy.
So people shouldn't have the expectation that maybe what was going on a year ago for people who were selling their homes. I mean, there's like bidding wars and all that type of thing, but not really the case now.
Not so much. It depends. Now, if you're in a lower priced range and you're in a really high desirable neighborhood and someone way underprices the home, you'll see multiple offers. You're just not going to see 40 of them on every single house that comes on the market like we were.
Okay. And same question, except if you're in the market to buy a home, what would you give advice for that person?
Be picky. Same thing. I would say that you have choices that you hadn't had before. I would say as you're working with your lender, ask really good questions. Your realtor will help you know what those questions are to ask just to make sure that you're in the very best program. There are so many programs out there that help with your down payment and closing costs. Ask and find out what those are, because we know that you are paying that higher interest rate. So if you can use any of the money that you have, any of those assistance programs that are out there and they're amazing, and be able to do an interest rate buy down, that gives you so much more buying power, even if you can bring it down 1 percentage point. So ask really good questions and have those good partners. Make sure your realtor is asking those questions with you. Make sure your lender is asking those questions with you. And if they're not, then ask them and see why they're not. And if they're still not, you know what? Then that's okay. Shop us. Find other people that are willing to really work with you and help you find that right house, but also help you find that right program to finance.
And you kind of touched on this in your answers, but say someone they're in the Treasure Valley. They don't have to sell their home, but they'd like to move, maybe an upgrade. Some in the same area though. But of course, if they sell their home, well, then they have to find another. For that person, would you recommend, is now a good time to do it? Should they wait a little, or is that hard to tell?
I think it's hard to tell. One thing that I do expect, we all expect, even after yesterday's news of the interest rates kind of percolating up a bit, we do expect the interest rate to level back out by the end of the year. Mm-hmm. So if interest rates can get back into anything at 6 or below, then we're going to start to see a lot more activity just by virtue of that. That could be a thing that you could wait for. For sellers, I would say it's really so dependent on your personal situation. If you have an assumable loan, check and see. That may be something that you could easily let someone assume, and then they can just cash out the difference. Mm-hmm. There's lots of ways that we're doing that right now. You could keep the home as an investment property if your loan that you have allows you to do that. Some don't, so you have to just check and make sure that you can lease your property out. But residential real estate is always just such a good investment. Maybe you don't sell it. Maybe you rent it. We're having a shortage in rentals as well. So rent it out and keep it and go buy the new one. there's a lot of opportunities in real estate.
And Tracy, we have just a little bit more time. Anything I didn't ask that's important to know when it comes to, home real estate in the Treasure Valley?
Well, I think I've touched on it a little bit, but I'll just say it again. Whenever you can invest in real estate, that's how you gain wealth. And if you are from a family that's never owned property before, again, don't think that it's unachievable. It is absolutely achievable. We have the Idaho Housing Authority here in Idaho, which a lot of states don't have, by the way. So we're very lucky to have it. And they are the epitome of using those good government dollars to help young people and young families, and even families who are starting over, to be able to get back into home ownership. So it's one of those ways and it's one of the best ways to gain wealth. So to give you an idea, a typical renter's net worth is around $8,000, which is up over the last few years from $5,000. So $8,000, where a homeowner net worth is around $325,000. So the idea that you can gain wealth and that you can open opportunities for yourself when you buy that home, and then later down the road, residential real estate, by the way, was never meant to buy and flip within a year and make 30%. So the idea that you have to hold it a little bit and you get those 5 to 8% increases year over year, you'd be surprised. In 7 or 8 or 9 years, you've got great equity. You sell that home and roll it into the next one. Or like I said, keep it and go buy the next one and start to build a portfolio.
Good advice. Well, thank you, Tracy, for taking your time to answer these questions. I know real estate is definitely a hot topic in the area. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us.
You bet. Thank you very much.
Gretchen and Tracy, thank you. Now we're joined by Dr. Daniel Meltzer with Regence Blue Shield of Idaho. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Happy to be.
It's an interesting time in healthcare. It's always an interesting time in healthcare. This week, fairly momentous with the public health emergency from the COVID-19 pandemic formally ending tomorrow. I think a lot of people have been a little bit over COVID for a while, but some of the more formal things are starting to end. And we thought it was a good time to chat with you about what we're seeing in the healthcare field. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, happy to talk.
So we've got that health emergency ending. It's been in effect for really just about the last 3 years. A lot has changed in that time. What do you see impacting the health insurance segment and healthcare generally coming up?
Yeah, so a couple things. Let's talk first about kind of the ending of the public health emergency, which really was instated to expand benefits during the pandemic. And now they will kind of return to what's covered under normal kind of health plan benefits. So primarily, sort of from an economic standpoint, what it means is that what we call cost shares or co-pays or co-insurance will apply. So as it relates to the pandemic, things like COVID-19 vaccinations, boosters will be considered preventive care, should be covered by most health plans, not at a cost if received in network. COVID testing, again, if it's ordered on an in-network provider, will likely include a cost share, a copay, or co-insurance. Over-the-counter COVID tests, which many of us have used, several times, will no longer be covered, and most likely will actually be an out-of-pocket expense. They will be widely available in the supermarkets and so forth, but will not necessarily be covered as they were under the public health emergency. And then the other things with regards to the public health emergency as it pertains to insurance, if people need sort of early or more medicine per se, they're often going to have to call the customer service team before just getting it at the pharmacy. So there's some tweaks really around the insurance as it pertains to the public health emergency. And then there's other things that we can talk about, for example, Medicaid or site of care and changes in payment models and things like that.
Yeah, we're going to get into some of that, but something that was interesting there is, these COVID rapid tests, which have been, for a while, the government would mail them to you, and then you could roll into an Albertsons or a Winco and get them for free. Now, when people think that they might have COVID, if they don't have a stockpile, like a lot of us do, and they need a test, they're going to have to pay for that. Are those fairly low cost still, do you think?
They are, and there's many of them. So there's a greater quantity, there's high availability. So the kind of supply and demand calculus tends to lower the cost accordingly. Think of it almost as an over-the-counter pregnancy test, which has been used, for decades. It's going to be somewhat akin to that. So you'll have the generic brand, you may have the name brand. There'll be 5 or 6 of them sitting on a Walgreens or an Albertsons or something like that. and people will be able to just sort of, pay for them, but they'll be out of pocket. They no longer will be covered per se as they were during the pandemic. And, costs range $5 to $20 ish, depending on the type of test, the brand of test, et cetera.
Sounds like if people want to stock up, today's the last day to do it. So maybe some good advice since this all ends tomorrow. Let's talk about the expansion to Medicaid that has happened. Are we going to see a change for Idahoans who are on the Medicaid program?
We will. So really what happened during the pandemic is what was called sort of Medicaid redetermination. So Medicaid protection was put in place at the beginning of the pandemic to expand coverage for people that otherwise would be ineligible. Congress recently passed a bill that ends this continued coverage. So when the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, DHW, determines that eligibility for Medicaid, they're actually working on determining eligibility for the remainder of the year, and it will no longer keep ineligible individuals on Medicaid as this Medicaid protection no longer applies. So DHW will be processing, reevaluating who will get coverage. They're doing it on a monthly basis. And candidly, it may impact more than 150,000 Idahoans who began 2023 with Medicaid protection. As of now, the numbers are about 25,000 have already been determined to be ineligible. Now, having said that, people who are no longer eligible for Medicaid may be able to do a couple things. They may be able to apply for a tax credit to help pay for health insurance, and they can do that through Your Health Idaho, which is our state's health insurance marketplace. And Your Health Idaho may then contact individuals about eligibility for the tax credit and or how to enroll in individual health insurance if needed.
We'll have that website address right here at the bottom of the screen for people who want to see that.
Perfect.
We know that COVID just, it made massive changes in all areas of our society. What are you seeing for some of the ways that we think this is going to endure for challenges to healthcare coming out of the pandemic, both on the good side and maybe on the not so good side?
Yeah, we had to get creative. We had to get kind of scrappy. So, for example, one of the things that we saw that I think will endure, in fact, it's already continuing to endure, is virtual visits / telehealth / what we call digitally enabled care, where people are using means just like you and I are to contact health providers. So we know that from the beginning to now the end or end-ish 2018 to 2022 time frame, that virtual health visits have doubled, in some case tripled. Wow. Nearly 2/3 of people surveyed in a recent Deloitte survey had used a virtual healthcare visit. It's convenient. It's often lower expense. So I think that we'll continue to see telehealth, virtual care, what we call digitally enabled care, to continue, certainly for certain indications. Other things, surgeries, for example, not amenable to telehealth. Some of the challenges that we've seen is people postponed many of their routine or even elective procedures or screening exams. And we're still struggling with that when you look at preventive care. So things like cancer screening, immunizations, even well child or well adolescent visits. We don't do great as a state compared to other states with these preventive screening mechanisms. So we have to kind of rally again and remember it's time to get your mammogram or your colon cancer screening or your flu shot, pap smear, for example. Get your children checked to make sure they're growing and developing appropriately, getting their screening blood tests. Those things, it's important, I think, that we sort of up the ante, if you will, now that we're sort of coming out of the pandemic and they've oftentimes been postponed.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I went and saw my primary care doc for a wellness screening about a month ago, and it was the first time I'd been in since 2019. And it wasn't negligence, but it was just like,
correct.
Nobody was doing it for 2 years, really. And then life's busy and you're like, oh, wait, gosh, it's been 4 years. I need to go get in and do that. Are we seeing some slowing some return from the slowness of elective surgeries? Obviously, those completely stopped for a while, restarted, then kind of stopped again when we had some of those crisis standards of cares issues. Are we seeing that kind of come back now?
We are. I mean, and although we call them elective surgeries,
Sure.
they're still medically indicated. So, if your hip's bothering you, you may have postponed it because you could still perhaps get around, but that hip is in all likelihood still bothering you or getting worse. So we are seeing things like orthopedic surgeries, urologic surgeries, head and neck surgeries, general surgeries, et cetera. We're seeing upticks in those because those symptoms don't go away. They may not be acutely life-threatening. So yes, the surgical volumes are in fact increasing and have been over the last couple of years.
Is there concern about, we went a couple of years with people not getting some of these screenings, not doing these elective surgeries or medically urgent surgeries? Do you worry that down the road that this is going to sort of turn into a debt on society and we're going to have some big medical challenges from people because they aren't doing it or they stopped or they paused? Or, are we headed for some choppy waters there, do you think? Or do you think things will level out?
Well, probably both. I wish I had a crystal ball. We already, emergency department volumes are up. So people are certainly seeking care. Again, our preventive screenings for things like cancer are terrible in many cases. And so the worry is, will we see more cases of breast cancer, colon cancer, not only more cases, but more cases that have progressed to the point where they're more severe and require more intensive therapy, if therapy is available at all, depending on the stage of cancer. So things like that I do worry about. For example, we've seen massive upticks in behavioral health needs, particularly amongst adolescents. And if you're not taking your child or your adolescent to get screened routinely, you may not be aware that there are certain problems that exist that can turn into things like substance use or more severe problems downstream. So I think the take home is it's time to go back and get our screening exams, much as we did on a regular basis, because those diseases don't stop for time.
What about this the behavioral health side and the mental health side? I think we're starting to see as a society become more and more of a pressing challenge. Do you think that kind of interacts here? We're seeing even just a shortage of counselors in Idaho, and just going and talking to somebody is sometimes challenging for people. Do you think that all plays together, and are there worries that we're going to see consequences from that as well?
We already are. The other pandemic, if you will, really has been around behavioral health.
Mm-hmm.
That can be depression, that can be mood disorder, that can be anxiety, it can be stress management, it can be substance abuse, some of which times is related. We know that people with behavioral health conditions tend to be 3 times more expensive than people with, behavioral health conditions and medical conditions tend to be 3 times more expensive than those with one or the other. We know people with behavioral health conditions often have medical conditions. People with medical conditions often have behavioral conditions. They go together. So it's really the other pandemic, if you will. We know that access is a challenge. It has been a challenge in Idaho. The good news is there's been hundreds more behavioral health providers credentialed in the state of Idaho over the past several years. We also, back to the telehealth piece, behavioral health is particularly suitable for virtual care. So there are many, many excellent alternatives to an in-person visit that can be managed vis-a-vis telehealth, and that can be for a wide variety of behavioral health conditions. Don't forget, behavioral health is not just one condition, just like physical health is not one condition. Cancer is different than hypertension, is different than diabetes, is different than reflux, and the same goes for behavioral health. Depression may be different than anxiety, requires a different intervention than obsessive compulsive disorder, requires a different intervention than substance use disorder. So there is a wide variety of services available. The key is to A, identify that I or someone that we know has a problem, and B, talk to your provider or health plan about how to access these new and, frankly, in some cases, improved modalities for behavioral health care.
Yeah, telehealth really has made going to a counselor, doing a lot of routine visits so much easier. I haven't figured out how to do the dentist virtually, though. I'd really like that if we could figure that out.
Let me know.
That would be super helpful. What should patients, people think about when they're looking at for a healthcare provider in this kind of formal post-COVID era?
There's a couple things, that people I think need to think about in terms of where to go and when to go. First of all, we talked a little bit about this. What's the urgency of the condition? Is it something, you're having a hard time breathing? Are you having chest pain? Those are significant. We want you to get care in a timely manner. Other things may, like we talked about, preventive screenings, wellness checks. So the element of time and urgency. The other thing in terms of time is how timely and how available are some of those services. So waiting for primary care physicians is often recommended for most things because it tends to be a little more comprehensive. It tends to be a little more consistent, but that can take days to weeks. Telehealth, urgent care is often available, within hours. Emergency departments are available 24/7, but there's a cost to that economically, and there can be a cost in terms of time and waits, and we want to make sure that those services are available for those that need them most.
Let's talk about fee for service. So first, if you can explain for people what fee for service is, I think that's helpful because I'm not sure everybody is fully versed in some of these jargony terms for insurance. So help explain what fee for service is and that model is.
Yeah, fee for service is sort of the traditional or kind of older method of paying for healthcare. Frankly, it's the method that you pay for any service. You have a plumber come to your house and they charge you a fee and you pay it. That's really no different for healthcare. You see a clinician and they do something and tests, procedures, exams, interventions, and they bill and they get paid. The challenge has been historically with that is that it is added and added and added to the national healthcare spending, which is, about 6.8 trillion anticipated by 2030. It's gone up way more than the cost of living. So that trend has not been sustainable for a variety of reasons, not only economically, but we want to ensure that the payment that we're rendering is for the right care, is for high quality care, that we're not just paying for things to be done. We're paying for the right things to be done in the right way.
So then are there alternatives to the kind of pay a plumber model? What does that look like? And do you think that that's needed? And if so, are you optimistic we might see change there?
It's 100% needed. It's already in place across the country. CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, has instituted these kind of alternative payment models now for many years, and health plans have followed with depending on their various lines of business. So there can be fees plus performance standards, so that there's a fee, there's a baseline fee, for example, and then there's additional standards that have to be met to receive additional compensation. There can be things, and there are things like bundled payments. So you get a payment, a sum of money for a group of related services. So you have to care for a patient within this context of money so that it incents the right care over time by the right people. There can be condition-based payment, which you get paid based on a medical condition. So you get a sum of money, and then providers in the system are expected to manage and address those health problems with that amount of money. There can be episodic payment or time-based payment, where payments are bundled or warranted for a series of services over a period of time. The idea really with these alternative payment models is to align patients, we're all patients, healthcare providers, and payers, such that patients receive the care they need to address their conditions, and they don't receive unnecessary or unavoidable or avoidable services. The challenge with paying to do is we tend to do more, and if we do more, we can harm people. So we know that not all medicines are safe, and not all surgeries are safe, and not all hospitalizations are safe. So we want to ensure the right care at the right time. So that's a quality mechanism, if you will, for patients. For providers, they're able to deliver the services their patients need. They're not going to lose money. They perform better. They get more money. And for payers, it's kind of the arbiters of expense, if you will, to try to manage the system. Really, you're paying for the right care at the right time in the right place.
I'm trying to align some incentives a little bit there.
Right, exactly.
Dr. Daniel Meltzer with Regence Blue Shield of Idaho. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That is the BoiseDev Outlook presented by Regence Blue Shield of Idaho. Thanks to all of our guests, Dr. Daniel Meltzer, Peter Oliver, Tracy Kasper, and Elaine Clegg for joining us, and to Gretchen and Margaret for hosting. We've got a great event coming up this fall called The Intersection from BoiseDev. Really excited about this, kind of a unique thing. It's going to be in person. Be watching for that. We appreciate you watching, and we appreciate your support of BoiseDev.
There's no place quite like Idaho. That's why Regence Blue Shield of Idaho is constantly reimagining the healthcare experience, tailoring it to fit the needs of local families and businesses. Rooted here since 1946, we're shaping the future with cutting-edge digital solutions, Idaho-based customer service, and unparalleled access to top doctors. That's the Regence difference you can count on. We get you,